I have the opportunity to introduce to you my good friend and colleague, Dr. Jay Singh. I came to know Jay through the American Psychology Law Society and the International Association of Forensic Mental Health Services, and I can tell you he is really a very prolific scholar, an extremely productive young man. He started out at the University of Oxford, did his PhD, and came to the University of South Florida in North America, I don't know, 3-4 years ago. And he actually worked with one of our former mentees, Sarah Desmarais there, and Richard Van Dorn, Dr. Randy Otto, Dr. John Petrilla, some very prolific scholars there. And he is now embarking on an exciting new venture, the Singh Institute in Forensic Research. I think it should be the Singh Institute in Research for Forensics, so it could be SURF. Would be a better acronym, but we can talk about that over dinner. In any event, he's going to talk to you about some of his work on violence risk assessment, the application of his research to clinical practice, and I think it has application for the inpatient setting, correctional settings, forensic, general mental health, and so hopefully should enlighten us and get some good discussion going. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Thank you. How's everybody doing? Good. Everyone feeling good? Halfway through the day, everybody's after lunch, things sinking in, a little bit tired. I completely understand that. So you guys know how this typically goes. There's always that 1 or 2 awkward entrances after a while of people sneaking in. So our goal collectively, we're a team, is to make those people feel unbelievably awkward about themselves. Okay, so here's what we're going to do, right? I just want somebody to memorize this little thing, right? Those first few slides were truly some of the best I've ever seen in any presentation ever given at any lecture by man or beast. Not only my education, but my life will be forever changed due to what you said. One day when mankind lands on Mars, I can only hope that the first words spoken can stand up in some small measure to the tremendous contribution that you've just made to everyone in this room. So if someone could just memorize that for me, that'd be great, and then we'll work together. Great. So, okay. So our agenda today, guys, is to basically accomplish 4 points. Right? So point number 1 is, what's the problem when it comes to violence? Why is this something where we're having this meeting today? Is this actually something that's so big of a public health and safety issue that we actually need to take the time out of our busy schedule to be able to discuss it? That's number 1. Number 2 is, okay, if it is an issue, then what are we doing about it? What's the next step, right? What's happening in the research? What's happening in practice right now? Number 3 is, okay, that's great that we know what's happening now, but what's next? What's the next big step for us as a field? How can we innovate and move beyond where we are right now? And number 4 is, what can I really do for you? How can I help? It's important to me that you guys know that today I'm here for you.
Those
this is
first few slides.
These things. Incredible. I know, sir. So sorry. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. There were mythological creatures never before seen. It was. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. So this is definitely something that is very exciting for me to be able to be here to talk to you about. This is something that I'm incredibly passionate about. This is a field that I kind of stumbled into myself. It's not something where at the age of 8 I was like, I want to assess violence risk. But it's something that I've grown very, very passionate about. So really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. So first thing I'd like to talk to you about a little bit today is the epidemiology of violence. And when I use this term, the epidemiology of violence, what I'm really referring to is the epidemiology of mental health and violence. And the reason is that, I mean, we've had a few really tough years in North America, right? I mean, just in the States in the past year and a half, I mean, how many mass murder spree shootings have we had? It's getting crazy. From Sandy Hook to Aurora, Colorado, Naval Yard shooting, I mean, the list goes on and on for us. And it's something where us as mental health professionals have kind of become the de facto gatekeepers of dangerousness, of violence risk in the community, whether we want that responsibility or not. And the reason that it's our responsibility, or it's been heaped upon us, is because there's a general sense in our communities that no one sane could ever perpetrate such evil acts, right? So they think, well, there must be something, you know, mentally wrong with these people. And it's something where the media obviously doesn't do anything to really disabuse people of that belief, right? I mean, think about some portrayals, right? So if I look at this kid, right? He looks like a really nice kid. He's out in public, he's got a big smile on his face, he looks like he's pretty in shape, right? He's obviously a little bit social, he's got a name tag on so people can come say hi to him, right? Big smile on. But we never see a photo like this in the media, right? So this is Jared Loeffner. We see photos like this. right? Same guy, but we never see. We always see these photos. There's something a little bit off. That's that idea. This is them, and we're us. That's them. We put them in a separate category, right? Nice kid, big smile. He's at summer camp. Gave a nice little presentation on neuroscience and all, right? We don't see James Holmes like that, though, right? We see James Holmes like this. This guy here looks like a kid that I went to elementary school with. His name's Alex Kim, big artist, very smart guy. And so is this kid, super smart, a little bit quiet when he was growing up, right? But we don't see these friendly elementary school photos like this, right? We see Cho looking like this in the media. And this isn't something that's just in the States or in North America. This is a global thing, right? So for example, if I think about a place in Northern Europe, right? I don't see this cute little Roman kid, dressed up as a soldier in a school play. Right? No, when I see Breivik looking like that in the media, right? And the thing is that this can be done for absolutely anybody. This isn't something where it's just these people who perpetrated these acts, right? So to give you an example, this is me, right? When I was a few pounds more than I am now, with this incredible, look at this Superman thing I got going on. Just amazing. This took years of twirling to get that going on, right? So this is me. A few years ago, just last year, I gave a talk in Massachusetts. And when I was there, I was at a local private high school, and they had this person come with a camera. And I'm a real ham, so when I'm up there on stage, I'll be talking, and I'll see the person get ready, and you give them a good little stand, so that it's going to be good. It's going to be in the newspaper, right? But of all the hundreds of photos that they took, right, this is the one that they ended up selecting, right? I've got my eyes, I don't know if you can see this, are huge. I've got my hands thrown up. I've got these terrified children behind me. And the entire line is Jason dissects the minds of psychopaths. This does not help, right? This is not helping my case. And it's not just in the media, though. I don't help myself. Back when I was in the UK, you typically hear a place, I said Oxford. I went to Oxford. You hear a school like that, you're like, oh my God, this guy's a really serious scholar, right? Okay, this was me when I used to live in the UK. I was the lead singer in a British alternative rock band, right? I've got these little Satans on my gloves you can barely see, right? Little skulls, this long hair. I look really serious. Now you look at something like this, you think, whoa, these are some tough customers, right? Little do you know that Bart's a librarian, right? This is Gav, he's a sound engineer, and this really sketchy looking guy in the hoodie, this is Steve. He's one of the leading bioethics researchers in the UK. Right? But you wouldn't know. You just see something like this, and all of us, it's evolutionary, right? We just make that assumption. We say, okay, these guys look dangerous. We're going to make an assumption about these people, right? So the big question is, when it comes to mental illness and violence, is that a general stigma in the first place? So there was a neat study that was done back in 1996, got published in 1999, by these guys called Pesco, Salido, and colleagues. And what they did was pretty straightforward. They took 5 vignettes, like 1-paragraph stories, and they basically showed it to a bunch of people. And these vignettes, they basically described diagnostically different diagnoses, everything from major depression to cocaine dependence. And they asked afterwards a series of simple questions. And one of them was, in your opinion, how likely is it that this individual described in the vignette will be violent towards someone else? And they had them say, not likely at all, not very likely, likely, or very likely. Those are the 4 options that they had, right? So these are the findings of the study. Now always, whenever you take a look at a table, there's a million things to look at, so I'll just point out the important thing for us to look at, right? So here we go. Here were the vignettes. We had alcohol dependence, major depression, schizophrenia, cocaine dependence, and then the last one was just a generally troubled person, not somebody that we would actually diagnose with anything per se. And what we found was when we're dealing with SMIs, so severe mentally ill populations, like individuals with schizophrenia, 61%, so on average over half of people said, hey, this person is either likely or very likely to be violent towards someone else. So it seemed like there was the stigma. So after findings like this came out in really big journals like American Journal of Psychiatry, there was this outpouring of funding. There was all this money aimed at reducing the stigma towards the mentally ill. There were educational initiatives, all kinds of things were done. So Pesco, Salido, and colleagues got together again in the 2000s. They said, hey, we need to see whether or not this has changed or not. What has kind of happened after we've put all this money, time, effort, etc., into reducing stigma? So the big question is, has it gotten better? So when they did their follow-up study, this is what they found. Let's focus on the red. The red bars here is when we're dealing with schizophrenia, right, as our population. So we actually found that when it comes to wanting to have somebody diagnosed with schizophrenia as a work colleague, as a neighbor, and in terms of them being likely to be violent towards themselves or violent towards others, the stigma got worse. It's gotten worse since the 1990s. We put all this money in, and the stigma's worse than ever, which is kind of a when you think about it. So the big question is, oh, okay, well, is this something new? And it's really not. So back in 1955, there was a guy named Starr, he was a sociologist, and he did one of the first ever nationally representative surveys of the public image of mental illness in the United States. And this was his conclusion at the end of the article. He said, mental illness is a very threatening, fearful thing, and not an idea to be entertained lightly about anyone. Emotionally, it represents to people a loss of what they consider to be the distinctly human qualities of rationality and free will. And there is a kind of horror in dehumanization. As both our data and other studies make clear, mental illness is something that people want to keep as far away from themselves as possible. Now the sad part is, if I were to take that data away and read that exact conclusion to you, it could be just as relevant today as it was back then. Maybe it's a little bit less blunt, a little bit more PC these days, but generally speaking, I think we can all agree that there's that feeling still. I remember when I was in grad school, so when I was in the UK, and I had my supervisor call me one day. He said, Jay, I need you to come over to my office. He said that over the past few years, he'd been collecting news clippings of these kind of sensational headlines about mental illness and violence, and he wanted me to take a look at them. Now, we were in the UK, so I thought it was going to be something like, psychopath drops cup of tea, nation mourns, or something like that. I thought it was going to be something like that. But instead, it was stuff like this, right? Hell, a schizo killer raped me. Schizo killer caged for life. Fury at escape of killer schizo. These are three totally different cases in 3 totally different years. So in a newspaper that's known to be a little bit sensationalist, it's kind of like USA Today, big picture, sensational headlines. But the thing is, we all know what happens, right? It's classical conditioning. The more that I see schizo and killer put together, the more I'm going to say, okay, all killers have something mentally wrong with them, and all individuals with something mentally wrong with them are more likely to be violent, right? So we just naturally put these things together. So obviously we need to know what's all this huffing and puffing about when it comes to that link between mental illness and violence. Is there actually empirically based evidence for that, right? So here's what we know. It's true, right? The annual incidence of violent crime in individuals with some severe pervasive mental illness is on average 4 times higher than the general population. We do know that. We also know that mental illness in general, right, that it is consistent, although a modest predictor of violence. We do know that, right? This is statistical findings. But here's also what we know. We know that mental illness only accounts for 3 to 5% of violence in the general population. In countries like the US, this has been replicated in other countries like Sweden, where the violence rate's much lower. So if you think about that, take every person who is, let's say, convicted of a violent crime in a year, and you put them on an island, right, if they have mental illness, we're still going to have 95 to 97% of all the violent incidents that we're seeing, right? So this isn't something where everyone is mentally ill. It's actually a minority. We also know that there's a statistic, it's called the NND. Now, I don't know about you guys, when I hear statistics, I throw up a little in my mouth, right? So the NND is pretty simple. It's how many individuals who I say, yeah, these guys are at risk, would I need to take and put into, let's say, a prison. I would have to detain them so that I could prevent a single incident of violence in the community, right? And when I say violence, that's a little general. I've racked my brain to think about what's the scariest thing the average person could think about. And what I've come up with is something like you're walking through a park and a guy jumps out from behind a bench. You don't know this guy, he's a stranger. He's acting in accordance with his delusions and command hallucinations, and he ends up killing you, right? So it's a stranger homicide. That's the technical term, right? Well, to stop one of those incidents, the thing that people are most afraid of, you would have to detain 35,000 individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia. This is an extraordinarily low base rate phenomenon, despite what the media tells us how scared a lot of people are, right? Also, there's no real clear evidence of a causal link between mental illness and violence. We've tried in a whole lot of studies to be able to figure out what causes what. Are there certain kinds of symptom groups or whatever that actually cause violence? But we don't really have anything conclusive in that. Everything is correlational, and as all of our Stat 101 teachers taught us, right? Correlation is not causation, right? And last but not least, there are a lot of demographic factors, for example, being male, being young, being unemployed, that are much more reliable and powerful predictors of violence than mental illness alone. So that's the thing, is it's not that mental illness is like this standalone amazing predictor of violence, right? Other things are much more predictive. Last but not least, we oftentimes forget that victimization is much more of a problem than perpetration when it comes to the mentally ill. It's something where, on average, ironically, there's between 3 to 6 studies published on perpetration for every 1 study on victimization, though. So it's not just a bias in general, it's a bias in the research literature as well, that we all have to deal with and be conscious of. Now, I don't think that any of us would doubt that violence is, without a doubt, a major public health problem, right? So World Health Organization, they publish reports on the leading causes of mortality. Interpersonal violence that's not related to some kind of warfare is consistently one of the top 20 leading causes of death. And if we add to that some other facts and figures, like the fact that the prison population worldwide is over 10 million right now, and this is increasing in over 70% of countries. Of course, if there's one study that knows how to lock people away, ding, 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 United States, right? If we take the U.S., take a look at the U.S., 1980 to 2006, we've seen a 500% increase in the number of individuals in jail and in prison. This isn't even taking into account the massive iceberg beneath the surface, which is probation and parole, right, where a lot of our costs go. Also, if we take into consideration that in some countries, what we're seeing, particularly in Western Europe, is a drastically increased number of forensic psychiatric beds, right? So for instance, there was a study done in 2008 by Predictive and colleagues. They were looking at Western Europe. And here's what they found. They found that in countries like Austria and Denmark, England and Germany, Netherlands and Switzerland, that the number of forensic beds per 100,000 people in the population doubled or either tripled between 1990 and 2006. Now you might look at these numbers and they do look really small. Let's take England for example, right? Here's England. So we went from 1.3 to 2.5 beds per 100,000 people. You look at that and you're like, 1.3 to 2.5, who cares? Right? But the thing is, right, this is per 100,000. Keep in mind how many millions of people are in these countries. And here's the most important thing. In the UK, we have 3 general levels of security, right? We have low secure units, medium secure units, and high secure units. The average cost of a low security bed tends to be between 20 to 40,000 pounds per year, right? The average cost of a high security bed is over 300,000 pounds per year. And here's the issue. Who are we putting into those high security beds? These aren't the guys who are easily going to get better, you know, they're responding to treatment. These are the severe and refractory cases where there's just nothing we can do. So like the head of Broadmoor once told me over there, he said, this is basically like freezing a bacterium. That's what we're doing. If we ever let them out, there would be problems. We can't really do anything. So we're waiting for them to kind of pass away or for researchers to find some new form of evidence-based therapy that can actually do something. And the scary part about that is, as time goes on, these people are alive, so there's no more beds. So what do we do with the high-risk people who need those beds? And the only answer is we just put them into lower levels of security. So this is a huge issue in the UK right now. We're taking the high-risk people, we're putting them into medium secure units. And what's happening is we know from the literature, it's not that if you take a high-risk person, you put them with lower-risk people, that all of a sudden their risk goes down. The risk of everybody else around them goes up, right? So that's the issue that we're dealing with, a very serious problem. And so if we take all these facts and figures and we combine them and we add that critical element, which is the huge demand by our community to be able to be protected, then what we get is a commensurate demand for both accurate and reliable methods of violence risk assessment. And that's the key thing to talk about today. So let's talk a little bit about violence risk assessment. I love this picture. See, he's measuring risk. This is what it's come to, people, okay? Risk assessment jokes. Be prepared. There are a lot on the way. So, simple definition. I'm sure that we all know what I'm talking about when I say violence risk assessment, just to make sure we're all on the same page though, right? Violence risk assessment is the attempt to predict the likelihood of future violence in order to identify those at greatest need of intervention. The key here is that at the end of the day, we don't assess violence for the sake of doing it, right? We assess violence to identify treatment targets, to formulate risk. We do it so that we can actually do something about it. At the end of the day, risk assessment and risk management, inextricable from one another. We do one to accomplish the other. Now, when it comes to risk assessment, it's used all the time in both mental health and correctional settings. If you're working in mental health, just to give you some examples of points of contact where this could be used, right? So in terms of making involuntary commitment, right? In terms of deciding whether or not that individual is a serious threat to themselves or to others, which typically, in a lot of countries, this is something you need to establish before involuntarily committing. What about once they actually enter your unit? What security level should they be on? Should they have a roommate or not? Or are they going to get in trouble? Do we need to put them on suicide watch? So on and so forth, right? In terms of service plan development, what are those critical risk factors and key protective factors that we need to focus on to be able to make sure that whatever management plan we put into place is as effective as possible? Next, resource allocation. We need to identify the people at highest risk and give them more resources when it comes to risk reduction than individuals who are at lower risk. Makes sense? And last but not least, in making discharge decisions. Is this person safe to send back into the community? And we see the exact same thing when it comes to corrections, right? So the initial arrest. Can I take this guy, put him in the back of a paddy wagon with 10 other guys, or is he going to have a brawl in the back of this car? So I need to take him alone. What about in terms of setting bail? Do I even set bail in the first place? Is it safe to get this guy back into the community? Big question to ask, right? How about in terms of pre-sentencing, right? How long should this guy's sentence be? Or if I'm going to let him out, right? So during custody and when I let him out, do I need to give him some kind of supervision? What the level of service do I need to provide this guy? And then, of course, same thing as discharge, making release decisions, right? So at the end of the day, people are going to go back and forth in terms of how many approaches there are to risk assessment. Some people say that there's up to 5 or even 6. Other people say that there's only 2. Generally speaking, though, I think a lot of people would agree that there's kind of 3 really big general approaches to violence risk assessment these days. So the first one we call the first generation, right? So this is unstructured clinical judgment. The second we call actuarial risk assessment, and the third, which is relatively new compared to the others, we refer to as the SPJ, or structured professional judgment approach. Now all of these have strengths and weaknesses, no question. There's good things and bad things about all of them, and so let's just review those very quickly. Right? When I talk about unstructured clinical judgment, obviously there's no clinician in their right mind who's going to sit there, flip a coin, and say high risk, not high risk, right? And if you know that person, let me know. We'll do something about that, right? Typically, what we're talking about here is just using no particular structured method, no structured questionnaire, no objective criteria, no transparent criteria to evaluate the risk of someone. I, as a clinician, would use my judgment, my professional judgment, my experience with the client, and their idiosyncratic situation to be able to make a call as to the risk level of my client. Structured clinical judgment, right? So there are advantages. It's very convenient, right? I don't need to buy materials, don't need to be filing paper away or anything like that. It's also super flexible, right? Because I can basically take this approach and wrap it around any individual client that I'm dealing with, right? In addition, it's also widely accepted, even though now we've been in this structured phase for over 30 years almost, it's still something where we see that unstructured assessments are used in almost 40% of cases worldwide. We also know that unstructured clinical judgment can be quite useful at the individual level because it helps us to be able to develop individual-based risk management plans. But of course we have drawbacks. First, it's highly influenced by judgment biases. What if I was working in Aurora, Colorado, where that really tragic Batman theater shooting was happened, and I have a guy come into my private practice, start telling me about how he loves the Batman movies, he identifies with the Joker, guy's got crazy hair, he has a gun fetish, and he just dropped out of his PhD in neuroscience. If I were to hear that, the likelihood's quite high that I would be influenced by recent events. Right? It makes perfect sense why, but it's something where also these are situations where we're letting hindsight kind of influence us. So we have certain judgment biases that can influence us. In addition, predictive validity we found is kind of no better than chance, right? It's a problem. Also, low inter-rater reliability. If me and Dr. Smith down the hall, also in private practice, assess the same guy, we can come to totally different conclusions in terms of the risk level, what we're dealing with, right? So a lot of people started to say, so that we're not kind of flipping coins, right, that what we need to do instead is have some kind of a structure. So there was a reaction against this in the 1980s, and what we started focusing on is what's called actuarial risk assessment. Now typically when you hear the word actuarial, you think of something like insurance, right? If I'm a guy, my insurance rates go up. If I drive a red car, my insurance rates go up. Sports car, insurance rates go up, so on and so forth. It's the same kind of an idea. If you're male, okay, violence risk goes up. If you have a history of crime, violence risk goes up. Unemployed, violence risk goes up. Same kind of an idea there. It's very mathematical, and it's basically something where the clinician at the end of the day doesn't really have a role except to accurately fill out something that looks like a little questionnaire, a little tick box. You end up getting a total score, let's say it's 10. I take a little manual, I flip through it, and I end up getting a nice little table. I go through all the scores and I find where 10 is. I go over and it gives me a percentage. Let's say the percentage is 50%. That percentage, 50%, doesn't mean that Dr. Smith over here, who I just assessed, has a 50% likelihood of being violent. It means that when this study was first done to make this tool, out of the people who got a score of 10, 50% went on to reoffend. So this doctor over here, who I just assessed, he fits into a group where 50% of the group goes on to reoffend. Important idea, not the individual, the group, right? Hard to say anything about a particular individual when it comes to risk assessment. Really challenging, right? So some of the advantages here are that it's totally objective, right? The total score, the clinician doesn't decide on it. They just code everything through. Right? Also, we're using predetermined invariant weights to be able to fill out the instrument, right? We can improve reliability and predictive validity. We've seen this time and again in the research literature that these actuarial tools with their structure are better than these more unstructured judgments. We also know that these are a lot quicker, usually, than a lot of other approaches. Some disadvantages, though, like I said, the decisions are based on group norms, right? We have something called the broken leg dilemma, which means that idiosyncratic factors, those typically aren't taken into consideration. One of Tony and my friends, his name's Kaz Hawk, he's in the UK, told me this great story about the red cardigan story, right? Where he had a patient, a woman who was very pleasant, pretty nice woman, except when she wore a red cardigan. And whenever she wore this red cardigan, she would assault staff. And this was something where, it really kind of freaked people out. So apparently somebody went up to Kaz one day and they said, well, why don't you just take away the red cardigan? Right? Take away the cardigan. And the Kaz says, we tried that. And we took it away. And then she was assaulting staff and we just had no idea. So we had to give her the cardigan back, right? So there was actually this kind of red flag that could be raised. So that's the thing, is that sort of risk factor would never come up in the statistical analysis. It's too unique, right? So that's the thing, is that when you're using an actuarial instrument, you're going to miss out on those more idiosyncratic factors, right? And last but not least, because you can't take those individual things into account, sometimes you have issues when it comes to developing risk management plans based on these instruments. So a lot of people then in the mid-90s said, well, we don't like that either. We need something that combines the strengths of the clinically based UCJ, unstructured clinical judgment, approach with this more objective, more straightforward and transparent actuarial assessment method. So this was really where this SPJ approach was born, right? In terms of advantages, we're still including evidence-based and theoretically based risk and protective factors, no question, right? We're not using any weighting schemes, right, which is unique. So before, with the actuarial, you had no choice. You had to use what they were saying. SPJ tools, what you think is more important, you can give more weight to in terms of your formulation. Right? It allows for a lot more professional discretion. At the end of the day, it is you, not some manual, that says, is this person at low, moderate, high risk? What category does this person fit into? And last but not least, there's no broken leg dilemma. You can take those idiosyncratic factors into account. Now, as with anything else, there's disadvantages, right? Some people would claim that it reintroduces judgment biases. Some people claim that you end up seeing lower levels of reliability, though in the research literature, we're not really finding that. And last but not least, a lot of people believe that this is much more time-consuming to actually do the assessment. So this is what we know about these differences between the approaches, right? Now, there are so many risk assessment tools out there, right? Recent count is over 400 instruments are used to assess violence risk. And the most important thing, if you don't know this already, is to come up with a cute acronym, right? If you don't have a cute acronym, you are going to fail, right? Some of these here, you got cute, there's Sarah and the cover and these things. My personal favorites, right? There's one called the armadillo, right? Like that one a lot. There's one called the giraffe. Recent one that I really like is the samurai. Thought that was really cool. I've always thought that if I were to make my own risk assessment tool, I'd give it a cool name, like the Dynamic Risk Screening Instrument for Negative Grievous Harm, including sexual assault without engagement in sadistic or masochistic events, also known by its acronym, the Dr. Singh is awesome. I've always thought that would be the best thing for me. Just keep your eyes open. It's going to be very popular, I'm sure. It's a sex offender tool, so Stag 99, just the Dr. Singh is awesome 99. We've got some cool stuff going on. So, we have got all of these tools, and so obviously the big question that all of us need to ask ourselves is, well, which one do I use? That's the big question, right? And so at the end of the day, we just have a pretty simple answer, it seems, which is, well, which one works the best? The problem is, what do we mean by works? How do we operationally define how a tool works versus not, right? So if at the end of the day we accept that the goal in predicting violence, risk assessment, is to manage it, to prevent it, right? Then what we're looking at when it comes to risk assessment is a statistical property that we call predictive validity. Right? Fancy way of saying accuracy, not exactly the same thing, but if you want to think about that, I would say that's fine. Right? The issue is that we got 400 tools, And there's a literature on all of them. Sometimes you have many, many dozens of studies taking a look at individual tools. So you have so many studies, it's like impossible to wrap your head around this literature. So sometimes if you think about each one of these studies as like a tree, right, you need to take a step back, and instead of focusing on the tree, you end up focusing on the forest. You like that, did you? Come on. That's so what happens is that we decided, okay, you know what, maybe one thing that would be neat to look at is reviews of this literature, right? If there's just so much stuff going on, obviously the reviews are going to give us a much better sense at, in terms of trends, what we're dealing with in the field. So here's the problem, is we thought there was going to be 5 or 6 high-quality reviews that we'd be able to look at, but at the end of the day, we found over 40 reviews of this literature. And the funny thing is, a lot of them came to really conflicting conclusions on some pretty fundamental questions. And that's kind of worrying, right? So the big question that we had was, what are the major uncertainties regarding the utility of violence risk assessment tools? This was a big question for us. So we had so many reviews, we thought, well, maybe we need to review the reviews, right? And that's what we did. We did a meta-review, right? So what we did was we took a look at all the meta-analyses and all the systematic reviews that have been published on this topic. In the end, we found 40, and what we wanted to look at was conflicting findings. And these were the big uncertainties that we found, where reviews came to conflicting conclusions. Number one, which tool or tools perform best? Within a 6-year period, there was a whole bunch of reviews on 2 commonly used general recidivism instruments. One is the Level of Service Inventory Revised, the LSIR. There's also a tool, it's a personality scale, the PCLR, Psychopathy Checklist Revised, commonly used in the risk assessment process. So there were 3 reviews, right? One of the reviews said, oh, no question, PCLR, bam. Other one said LSIR, clearly dominant. And the third one said, oh yeah, no, they're totally both useful. They're all good, right? That's kind of concerning because it's just within a few years, used very similar kind of populations of studies and answered quite similar questions when looking at those reviews. Also, there was a discrepancy between some reviews found that actuarials so much better than SPJ tools. Others said they're just as good, right? When it came to whether or not they performed similarly for different groups of people, for men and women, for whites and minorities, for individuals of different psychiatric backgrounds, we found that there was really either a lack of evidence or very variable evidence in terms of the findings. And when it came to other things like how do tools perform when you're dealing with assessments over 1 year versus 10 years, or when you're dealing with a sample of 10 people versus 10,000 people, or when you're dealing with a population in the US versus Switzerland, where there's nothing bad happens in Switzerland for some reason. I was told when I went there, it's a totally random story, I was told when I went there that the people are so trustworthy that if you go out into the outskirts of Zurich, that you'll see farmers set up stands, and they have a little dish where you put money on, and then like all of this produce. And you just drive by, and if you want it, you get out of your car, you take the produce, you leave your money, and then you leave, right? And I was like, this is insanity to me. I thought to myself, like, all it's going to take to ruin your whole country is one American. I said, we're going to drive by, we're going to take your produce, we're going to take your money, and we're going to steal the dish. I said, we're going to take everything, you know? But anyway, random story. So, obviously there was a need for a new review from us, right, to be able to take a look at all these big issues, right? So that's what we wanted to do. So we took about 2.5 years conducting a new review. Now it's a new set of reviews to explore these issues. And what we tried to include what, at the time, were the most commonly used risk assessment tools according to surveys. So this included everything, I'll just do the acronyms, from the VRAG and the LSIR to the PCLR, the STAT-99, the SORAG, another Canadian tool. Those are the actuarials, and some SPJ tools, like the HCR20, which I'm sure you've heard of, the SARA and the SVR20, and a tool called the SAVRY. So these are the instruments that we took a look at, right? In terms of what we ended up finding, again, really busy table and a whole lot of stats, right? So don't worry, I'm just going to tell you what it means as opposed to trying to go through the diagnostic odds ratio, so on and so forth. So basically what we found was that if you went on to reoffend, you were 6 times more likely to be judged to be at high risk than if you didn't go on to reoffend, right? We found that of the people who did go on to reoffend, that around 92% of people were judged to be at high risk. And you may hear that and be like, whoa, this is great. But the issue is actually the next number, which is that only 36% of the people who didn't go on to reoffend were judged to be at low risk. So what that means is that we kind of have a general bias towards saying people are at higher risk than they actually are. That leads us collectively to be able to identify a lot more of the future offenders But we also have the issue where we're also saying a lot of people who are not at risk, they wouldn't have gone and done anything, that they're actually being said to be at risk. Right? So it's an important trend to be aware of. So in terms of how the tools performed overall, right, this is kind of the ranking across statistics of how the tools performed. But this is the interesting trend I want you to take a look at instead of focusing at the individual tools, which is that the instruments that were designed for the more specific populations and the more specific outcomes performed a lot better than the tools designed for kind of any offender population and any criminal outcome. And the reason that this is, well, we hypothesized at least, was that, well, the tools that are designed for more specific use are going to be used in a more specific way. You're going to follow the format, the protocol set out by the authors more specifically. And when you use a tool as it's designed to be used, you're a lot more likely to replicate those high levels of reliability and predictive validity that you read in manuals and such, right? So overall, in terms of those uncertainties, we found that there were really no differences between the performance of actuarials and those SPJ instruments. That demographically, I'll come back to this in a minute, the more white participants were in a sample, the more accurate, right? You ended up seeing tools perform. And the higher the mean age is, the more accurate. When I say higher mean ages, I'm not talking 60, etc. The highest mean age we're dealing with was late 30s, right? And last but not least, again, we found that when it came to study design, if a tool was being used to predict more specific outcomes, it performed better. So the big question is, why did we find this demographically? And the interesting thing is, when we take a look at those actuarial instruments, and we see who they were designed with, not designed for, they were designed for a very broad population, but who was the original sample? Oftentimes what you see is that a lot of the individuals in those samples were white, and their mean age was a little bit higher. So again, when the tools were being used as they were designed to be used on the population for which they were designed, then it performed better. Kind of makes sense, right? So at the end of the day, I know it's kind of like, whoa, shocker, right? But use risk assessment tools as they were designed to be used. Right? Straightforward, I think. So in terms of other uncertainties, we didn't find any difference in terms of tool performance between men and women, between predicting institutional outcomes versus outcomes in the community, also between different lengths of follow-up. But the gross majority of literature out there at this time, it was only taking a look at things over multiple years. There was nothing like the great START research, right, in Canada from Tanya and colleagues, where we end up having lengths of follow-up of 3 months at a time, taking a look at risk consistently. These studies that we were looking at, their lengths of follow-up in some cases were 15, 20 years. Right? So this is kind of an interesting, somewhat problematic thing. We did find, though, that the study pretty adequate levels of predictive validity, comparable levels, both in North America and abroad as well. So in terms of that list of uncertainties I gave you before, there's a few that I didn't focus on right there because there wasn't enough information in the existing studies that we looked at to answer those questions. So we actually had to do more reviews to find the answers to those. Right? So the first one was, how do these tools perform in different psychiatric populations, particularly when we're trying to prevent or at least predict the risk of community violence, right, in patients who are discharged? And then this one down here, which is, how do tools perform when you're dealing with jurisdictions that have totally different rates of violence? Right? So number one, different psychiatric populations. Here's what we did. We did a systematic review, not just of studies on individual tools. We wanted to identify every single tool that was out there that was published in any language for the specific prediction of community violence in psychiatric populations. And these are the instruments that we found. And the START's on here, which is great. And this was early days for the START when we did this review. So we were really surprised that at the time this review was conducted in 2011, that really only the HCR20 and the VRAG actually did studies where they took a look at performance in a specific diagnostic group. And the reason this is important is, if I have two different units side by side, in one it's everybody with major depression, and the other it's everybody with antisocial personality disorder, am I really supposed to treat these two populations equally when it comes to assessing violence risk and assuming that the tools are going to perform the exact same? Probably not. There are totally different diagnostic compositions in different units. And the alarming part is that in the majority of these studies, they didn't actually tell us the diagnostic composition of the sample. So we actually don't know whether the studies are actually more applicable to one group or another. It's very problematic, and it's something that we're getting better at now. And recently we put forward a proposal to be able to establish some guidelines where stuff like that is actually going to be required to be reported, or hopefully. Fingers crossed. Now what we did see was when we took a look at HCR20 and the VRAG, those two different tools where there is actually some information out there on these study findings, that when we took a look at median effect sizes, so median predictive validity, that there was still variability So if there was variability, then what that suggests is that if we're working in a unit or any kind of a setting where our current paradigm is that we conduct a risk assessment, right, and then we establish a formal diagnosis, and then we go after treatment, that it may be that we actually have to flip these and establish a diagnosis first, and then after that go for conducting a risk assessment that is informed by the diagnosis that we make, right? This is what it seems. So the next one is, we already know from a whole lot of literature published over who knows how many decades, particularly been a hot topic over the last 10 years, which is that we can't take a risk estimate based on a group, like that 50% number for that group, and assign it to Dr. Johnson, the one guy we just assessed the risk of, right? We can't do that. So a lot of people have said, well, that's true, but really what we're doing is we're taking that normative group where the tool was designed, and we're taking those estimates and we're putting them onto a new group. So we're not going group to individual, we're going group to group. So there's an obvious question to be asked here, particularly when it comes to those mechanical actuarial tools, which is this: those numbers in that manual, when I flipped it open, right, are those numbers transferable to different populations, right? I need to know that if in the normative sample, everybody who got a 10, I get them all in a room, I asked who recidivated, 50% said yes, that I don't go to Switzerland, get all my scores of 10 in a room, ask, and one guy went on to recidivate, right? I need to know that this is a reliable estimate. Otherwise, it can't be claimed that tools are equally accurate in terms of making these recidivism rate predictions based on these manuals that are being disseminated all over the world, over 44 countries, risk assessments being used. So this is a very critical question for us to ask. And what we found was that there is a tremendous amount of variability, statistically significant level of variability between the annualized rates of violence in individuals judged to be at high risk. If we take only the people risk bin of all these different tools, and we ask that question of how many of you went on to reoffend in an average year, right? What we ended up finding was it went everywhere from 0% to 100%, and there was variability both within individual tool literatures as well as between tool literatures, right? And we saw the same thing when it came to the SPJ tools, right? There's a little bit more variability here due to some of the sample sizes. But the important thing just to take in mind here, nothing that I'm saying today has to do with not using risk assessment tools. Completely not. That is completely the wrong thing, right? Risk assessment tools are the gold standard. They're actually quite amazing instruments, and they very much should be used. The thing to keep in mind is that these are not panaceas. These aren't something that are 100% accurate, not something where we should make decisions relying only on the instruments. And also, when it comes to particularly the actuarial tools, just be very wary when it comes to relying on these probabilistic estimates that you end up reading about, right? Because they're not necessarily reliable for your group that you're dealing with, which really places a call on us as a community of scholars, of clinicians to work together to be able to focus on more jurisdiction-specific norms and focusing on how we can come together at the local level as opposed to keeping everything in more the ivory tower when it comes to research on these instruments. Now, before I close up here, I've got about 13 minutes left. I want to talk to you about a neat new study that was done. It was a dream study. A big team was put together to be able to take a look at some international issues when it comes to risk assessment, right? So like I said, we have so many instruments and a really big research literature on how they perform. But ironically, the one thing that we don't have right now is a really strong literature about how they're used in practice. This gap is kind of developed between all this great research that's being done and how the tools are actually being applied. And now, even though we're working really hard these days to make this a new thing in the field where we're focusing on the field reliability and the field validity of the instruments, we were really curious at answering some really basic descriptive questions when it came to risk assessment tools, right? So these were kind of the burning questions that we had. What tools are being used? What are they being used for? For predicting violence risk, for maybe developing management plans for violence risk, for monitoring those violence risk plans, right? By whom? Are they only being used by psychologists, by psychiatrists, nurses, social workers, counselors, so on and so forth, right? Where are they being used? Is this just a North American and European thing? What happens if I go to Pakistan, Hong Kong? Are these things being used at all? And the biggest question of all, the one that was so surprising that we didn't have a strong answer to was, what do you think about them? What do you guys in this room, the most important people when it comes to any of the research that we're doing, the people in the field, do you even like these things or not, right? And if you do, what do you like about them? And if you don't, what do you not like about them? So that we as researchers who have, the onus is on us, the burden is on us, to give clinicians something that they like, that they can work with, that's evidence-based, right? That's our goal, so we need to get feedback on what people think about them. So what we found is we conducted a systematic review of previous surveys, and what we ended up finding was that, actually Denmark too, we found that the reviews were really, the surveys were only conducted in the US and the UK, there's one in Denmark now. They were only on psychologists. They didn't include other mental health professionals, right? They didn't target them. There were no questions on use and risk management specifically, right? Only general risk assessment. And there was only a single question on one survey that talked about perceived utility, right? And if you actually take a look at it, it asks a generic question like, how useful do you think this tool is? And then I think it says like 1 to 10. It doesn't tell you whether 1 is good or 10 is good. It just says 1 to 10. Just give it a number. 5. Woo! You know, whatever, right? So these burning questions, look how sad this guy is, right? They're still burning questions. We still want to know the answers to them. And so our initial dream was to basically take this, which is what we knew, what was happening in these countries, and build it into this, right? So basically expanded from a couple of countries to 17 countries. But we had such an amazing response from people around the world who wanted to help with this, and people coming out of the woodwork. We had the Armenian Psychiatric Society wrote to us. I was like, now I love Armenia. I'm like, I gotta go to Armenia. These guys helped us so much. And really brought their countries on board to the point where we went from 17 countries to actually covering 44 different countries on 6 continents. We were very, very lucky, and the data that we have, we're really hopeful will have some kind of an impact on what we're doing. Now, of course, in terms of the countries we explicitly targeted, these 17, it was everything from Argentina and Australia to Belgium and Canada, Chile and Denmark, Germany and Hong Kong, Mexico and the Netherlands, New Zealand, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, UK, US, and obviously the people in these countries don't speak the same language mostly. So what we had to do is take all of our materials and translate them into 9 different languages. From English and Danish to Dutch and French, German and Portuguese, 2 kinds of Spanish, European and Latin American, and finally into Swedish. So we had all these materials that we ended up building. We had to translate all of it and then disseminate it. And how we did it was actually pretty straightforward. I know it kind of looks a little bit complicated, but all we did was we made a web-based survey. And we made a little letter that said, this is what we're doing, here's the link to the survey. We took the materials, we translated them. We gave them back to the people actually in the individual countries who we were working with. They back-translated it to make sure that the translators did a good job. And then after that, we ended up putting it out to everybody and then analyzing the data. That's all we did. Right? So in terms of overall lifetime use of these instruments, we found that on average, in the average clinician's life, they spent over 50% of their assessment time using structured instruments to be able to conduct these assessments. Right? Now here's some findings that for me were kind of the most important and most shocking and the things we need to do something about. We found that we only receive as clinicians feedback on the accuracy of our risk assessments in 37% of cases. So what this means is that in 2/3 of cases, we make a risk assessment that we never find out whether or not something actually happened. And the reason this is important is because we know from many, many decades of social psychological research that the more often we get feedback on the accuracy of our judgments, the more accurate we end up becoming. So particularly when we're dealing with these SPJ or unstructured clinical judgments, that's quite important to be able to give us feedback on how we're doing, right? Now this is obviously a lot easier if we're dealing with intra-institutional outcomes as opposed to outcomes in the community, having to interface with local law enforcement, so on and so forth. Now also surprising to us was that in terms of getting feedback on whether I developed a management plan for Mr. Johnson. Okay, so I'm assuming that it's going to get implemented for him because I just told you how to manage his risk. We only get feedback on whether or not these things are actually implemented in 56% of cases. Right? And in 1/3 of the cases where people get feedback, the plans that they made, they're not implemented. This is a huge problem. We were pleased, though, to see that the majority of tools, they're being used because people preferred those tools. People are not being forced to use instruments, so on and so forth. They like to use them. They find them much more efficient, more transparent, so on and so forth. Now, in terms of just the past 12 months, right? We found that, again, an average of over 50% of assessments were done using a risk assessment tool. We found that in terms of the purpose of risk assessments, that around 90% of assessments are done for the explicit purpose of actually, assessing the likelihood of a future event. But we did find that in 70% of cases, the assessments were being done to be able to develop a risk management plan, and in 40% of cases to monitor that management plan. And the reason that's important is most of those historical, the actuarial tools, they only include, many of them, only include what we call static information. These are things that don't change over time, like history of substance use. I can't change that. Current substance use, I can do something about that, right? We call those dynamic factors because they can change. So if we're actually using assessments to be able to manage and monitor risk, we need to focus on more dynamic item content on instruments. And this is where that SPJ approach, and particularly newer instruments, like the START, that includes only dynamic item content, really shines. Also, in terms of the time frame of assessments, keep in mind that most of those actuarial tools that we're dealing with 5, 10, 15 years of follow-up, that's what's of interest to those tools, versus more of the SPJ instruments, shorter periods of time, wanting to track risk over time. So we found that in 73% of assessments, what's of interest is short-term, multiple weeks, multiple months. Not multiple years. That was actually of the least amount of interest, just over half. In terms of what's being used in the field and what's perceived to be useful, we found that basically, the tools that are older are used more frequently. Right? So we have tools like the HCR20, right, or the PCLR, or the screening version thereof, most commonly used for risk assessment. Same thing when it comes to management. The START, though, is the third most commonly used tool in the world right now for monitoring risk management plans, which is fantastic. And then when we asked about perceived utility, not overall, but rather people who were using the tool said, do I like it or not? What we found is that tools that are kind of more tailored, a little bit more positive, and use this SPJ approach are really seen as the leaders in the field. When it came to usefulness and risk assessment, there's a Dutch tool called the HKT30. Users really like that when it comes to assessing risk. HCR20, same thing. And then there's a tool called the SAPROV. It's kind of an add-on for the HCR20, focused on protective factors. People like that. When it comes to developing management plans, the Fortress, which is a Swiss tool, explicitly designed not so much for assessment, but for developing and managing these plans, these violence risk assessment plans. That was seen as being very useful, followed by the HKT and the SAPROV. And last but not least, the START came in second when it came to usefulness of people who actually use these instruments to monitor risk over time, right? Now, another question that we asked was, what were people's perceptions of actuarial versus SPJ instruments generally? And what we found was that when we restricted the outcome and we said, you can either talk about actuarial or you can talk about SPJ tools in terms of what you like, we found that SPJ tools were judged to take longer to administer, but also be more expensive on the negative, but on the positive, to be more accurate, more reliable, of greater interest to mental health review boards, and of greater interest to parole boards. The only place where actuarials dominated, interestingly, was in the courts. In the courts, people wanted numbers. Give us a number. Assign a number to this individual in some way, shape, or form. More objective. They like that, right? But interestingly, when we switched the question around and when we said you can say that both are equally useful, everything flushed out. Everything flushed out. Everything was equally useful except for SPJ tools were judged to take longer overall to administer. We asked also about clinicians' legal defensiveness, right? If you say that somebody's at low risk of violence and they go on to do something, are you afraid that that's going to happen, right? We wanted to get a sense at the overall general level about this. So we found overall that clinicians really don't worry about being sued for malpractice, right? After a false negative, saying someone's at low risk to go and do something. Or being criminally prosecuted after something like that happens. But what they do sometimes worry about is basically being obligated to use an instrument where they don't want to, or feeling like, you know what, this is a really ethically complex decision and I'm being forced to make it right now. So this is what people worry about a little bit. And when it comes to just general opinions about evidence-based practice, here's what we found. We found that clinicians don't believe that these instruments are useless, thank goodness. They don't believe that clinicians necessarily know better than researchers how to assess risk, and they don't believe that clinical experience alone is more important than the use of the tools. We found that clinicians would try a new tool, right? Even if it were very different from what they were currently using. They would use a new tool if it was required by their supervisor, by law, so on and so forth. And they would be more likely to use a new tool if they received training. That's super important for us, just to make sure that we're not just giving any training, that we really focus on the training, make it very high quality, and make it such that somebody who leaves that room feels comfortable in the use of that instrument. Now, before I let you guys go today, I want to talk to you just for a minute about an exciting new initiative that we just got started that you guys can be involved with, right? It was founded by myself and Dr. Kevin Douglas, who's at SFU. He's the head of the HCR 20 group there. So it's called the Alliance for International Risk Research. So remember before I showed you guys that big pile of predictive validity studies? There's just so much out there. We found that on average there's about 20 articles published each and every month on risk assessment, risk management. This is a huge literature, and the problem is that these things are published in over 80 different journals. So even if you signed up for 10, 15 journals, you would be getting a very small swath of all the literature that's out there when it comes to risk assessment. So it's kind of a big problem. Also, we decided to take a look at cost issues. We found that it's $600 if you don't readily have access to all of these different articles every single month on average. So it's expensive, it's crazy time consuming. We did a trial, it took 23 hours to find the articles, purchase them, print them, read through all of them. It's a crazy amount of time. And yet clinical guidelines in different countries, like CPA, suggest that you basically need to know how to assess violence risk. And everything needs to be evidence-based. And this is the evidence. So how do we get the evidence into the hands of hardworking practitioners like yourselves, but make it not expensive, making it as easily accessible as possible? So basically we developed a service for researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, where what we do is we have our trained team every single month. They find all the articles, they buy all the articles, they read all the articles, and they develop one-page summaries of not just what was done in the article, etc., but we also give you clinical implications, very clearly stated. There's no stats in the entire thing, thank God. And also, when it comes to legal stuff, we actually give you questions that you might get asked based on the studies if you ever are called before a tribunal of some sort, in terms of justifying the risk assessment approaches that you used. So it's a really neat thing. Also, we have exclusive risk assessment trainings that are only available through this, and I'm a guy who I always like to hear from the people themselves. So every single month, we basically go to a leading policymaker, researcher, clinician, and we do a full interview with them, asking them about what are some tips and tricks that you've found when it comes to using risk assessment tools in practice. What do you like? What don't you like? What do you think the future is? What tips do you have for practitioners? This thing is developed by a team of clinically oriented people for clinicians in the field. So that's what we're doing right now. The aims are really simple. We just want to promote the implementation of the latest evidence-based practices into mental health and criminal justice systems, providing a manageable resource for interested legal professionals and policymakers, and assisting researchers in staying up to date on the latest trends in the risk assessment literature. And the best part about this is that we're about to launch the product, so what we really need right now is actually beta customers who can get this for free and just tell us what you think about it, if you like it or not. Because at the end of the day, our goal is basically to give you, the clinician, the power, right? And so that's really what we're quite passionate about. So if you're interested in taking a look at this, or even if the unit would be keen to be able to be one of our beta customers, we would absolutely love that. And the last message for today is that we'll never be right 100% of the time. One of the most provocative articles I read was an article from the mid-2000s saying that if Jeffrey Dahmer had been given a VRAG assessment, that he would have been judged to be at low risk, right? So the thing is, at the end of the day, though, regardless, so long as the media continues in the newspaper, television, radio to publish these sensational reports, really focus on these incidents of mental illness and violence, as long as we have government reports out of places like University of Manchester, publishes a government report called Preventable Deaths, where it goes through every single year talking about different incidents that supposedly could have been prevented if, mental health workers had done their job, right? So not really positive. Also, so long as we keep seeing surveys of the public where we see this clear dangerousness stigma, and last but not least, so long as we have clinical guidelines that recommend that we need to be assessing the violence risk of these individuals, violence risk assessment isn't going away. And we just need to do the best that we can, work together in an interdisciplinary fashion, and move forward as one gigantic team of disciplines. So that is my message for today. Thank you guys so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And cards are up here if you're interested, and I also have sign-up forms for that air service if you happen to be interested. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jay. Very interesting. Is there any questions from the room or from the clinics? How am I going to tell if they have a question in the clinic?
The clinics should be able to just hit their microphone and submit a question if they got it.
Oh, great.
I just have to point out that even in Canada, if you leave your Halloween candy out, the bowl tends to be there, but the candy's all gone.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
So,
It's a higher risk population.
adolescents, and yeah, that could be the problem. I was curious about the project. Can you tell us a little bit about the distribution of your sample? So for the HK30.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's not something we've heard, I don't think.
That's
a
broadly
ton
used,
about.
absolutely.
So were
Sure.
there a lot of Dutch respondents, perhaps?
Sure, there were a lot of Dutch respondents. Okay. So we did take a look at things, subgroup analyses across countries and all, in which case, particularly the Fortress and the HKT wash out compared to tools like the Starter, the HCR20, that really have a lot more kind of exposure, a lot more penetration in different countries.
Penetration.
No question, no question.
Curious, thank you.
You thought, based on all the work that you've done
Sure.
for consolidating information, have
Sure.
you thought of developing like task force guidelines for risk assessment tools to sort of
Sure.
disseminate?
The big question that we had when we were going through all these things is that there, in the research literature, was very little standardization when it came to what was being reported and where. And because of that, it made it really hard to go through studies and actually get the information we needed to actually conduct the analyses. The reason why it took us 2.5 years instead of, let's say, half a year to be able to do these big, reviews was that we actually had to go back to the study authors and kind of, pester and poke so that we could get all of the data or all of the outcome information and all these different characteristics that we wanted to be able to test. It was very problematic. So really the first line of doing something like that is that we were very lucky. We had 37 scholars, including Tanya and some other great people from BC, get together, and it was a team of people from 10 different countries. And these are really like the big dogs in the field, the big leaders, who publish a lot of this research. And the thing is that typically these people have very different ideas of what should be reported, but there were certain things that everybody could agree on. And these are things that might sound silly, like if you report a mean, report a standard deviation, these sorts of things, but you would be surprised how rarely some of these things happen. And so what we did is that we all got together, we went through a 4-wave panel, right, and produced a set of guidelines that are not going to be published in Law and Human Behavior, so we just found out today. So that hopefully will be something that we as a field of researchers can use to be able to push the evidence base to a point where we will actually be at a place where we can publish more standard clinical guidelines. That said, you do have organizations like American Psychiatric Association recently, published kind of like an official statement on violence risk assessment, and we have the Handbook of Violence Risk Assessment by Kevin Douglas, Randy Otto. There's a number of texts out there that do seek to do that. There's also a very neat instrument. I think it's the CAIS, Dale McNeil, out of UC SF, San Francisco, where basically he developed an instrument to be able to evaluate who should be assessing risk versus not. Are you qualified to assess risk? That was a neat idea. It's something where there has been very little penetration of that idea, but it's something that I personally would like to see that kind of get out, just so that when we do trainings, we can make sure that we're getting people prepared in evidence-based ways that have been shown to increase the efficacy and accuracy of the instruments that we put out there and of the trainings that we end up performing.
I was curious about the finding that the courts prefer an actuarial assessment as opposed to other. And I'm just wondering if you have any theories around that. For instance, that the judiciary tends to be quite old by the time they're compared to the rest of the population, and like to work with the things they have had experience with, and or that because of the reliance on precedent, that, again, they would tend to look back at those things that have been raised.
I think definitely those factors certainly play a role. I think there's no question. Interestingly, one thing that was looked at, it was either 2006, 2009, at Silver and Monahan did a study where they took a look, asked judges, they said, how low risk, probabilistically, 1 to 100%, or 0 to 100%, can someone be and still be at high risk, right? And the answer was something like 25. It was a very low threshold that was set. So we wanted to replicate that. So in the IRIS, what we did was we asked the same question, but we split it up because Monahan and Silver, they took a look at dichotomous estimates. It's basically high risk, low risk, right? So we want to split that up a little bit more. So instead of saying low risk, high risk, we said low, moderate, high risk, right? So what we found was it was about, actually kind of perfectly distributed, about 0 to 24, 25% was, okay, there you go, that's like your low risk group, right? And then if you get from like 25 to about 70 or so, that's your medium risk group. And then your super high risk people are about 71 and above in terms of the percentages that we're dealing with. So it's something where there seems to be some kind of agreement that once you get above kind of that 20%, 1 out of 5 mark, that there's some risk that seems to be of concern. And I think that when it comes to putting these categorical estimates, so low, moderate, and high, I think that there's probably some sense out there that that's not objective enough. Now, whether that's true or not, I personally don't think it is. I think that the literature is showing us more and more these days that you can use those categorical estimates in a very reliable manner between clinicians. But I think that, as you say, people are used to what they've been doing for quite some time. Those actuarials have been around for at least 15, 20 years longer than the SPJ instruments that were mostly introduced in the late 1990s. So it's something where I think that there's still kind of this turnover that's happening slowly but surely, whereas in academia, it's something where, we're used to things moving sometimes quite rapidly, but then the trickle down that you end up seeing can sometimes take quite a lot longer unless we as researchers really focus on community engagement and really making sure that we are not in those ivory towers, but rather out there rubbing elbows, making sure that things are written in a very straightforward, simple, elegant, and understanding way, so that we don't kind of keep all of our, knowledge of secrets or whatever, kind of to ourselves, but write in a way that anybody can understand. I think that's very hard, but I think that's also something very necessary.
Do you think that...
Thank you so much for everybody for
Thank you guys very much. Appreciate it.